So, good morning, everyone. We're going to start off today's session with the panel discussion on the generalist particulars divide. And the motion that we have is the generalist particulars divide can be bridged. That's the motion we're working under. So we've had a lot of discussions and conversations, even through this conference, and open in the keynotes, talking about the divide. And since then, I think almost every speaker has referenced it in some way or another. So the question is, one of the questions, is it semantics, or what is this divide really? Is there even a divide? Should we keep it, or is it handy for our discussions? And we've got the best panelists, I think, to discuss this topic with, I think, varying intuitions. So it'll be interesting to be able to have this conversation in real life, not just reading in the literature about it and talking past each other, but to actually try to understand if it's helpful or useful. But actually, I think we all know each other a little bit by now. So can we start just by seeing what is the general intuition on this? So who would agree with the motion, if you don't mind showing hands? Can be bridged? Okay, wait, we're gonna hear from you soon. Okay, also most people. Okay, who believes that it can't? All right.
And I believe Stephen's going to tell us why later on today.
Sure.
No, I'm going to tell you why the whole thing's a waste of time.
Oh, okay, all right. That's awesome. So,
Maybe we should meet Stephen.
No, fine. I don't believe that.
But we'll start with Patrick, all the way from Melbourne, Australia. So, do you want to start with introducing yourself and your thoughts on the question?
Hi, yeah, I'm Patrick Stokes. I'm Associate Professor of Philosophy at Deakin University in Melbourne. Very sorry I can't be there in person today. I wasn't going to be able to get away at the moment anyway, but also it turns out I'm actually currently down with COVID. So it's probably just as well I didn't try and attend, because otherwise it would have had disastrous consequences for all involved. Thanks.
Do you have a little summary quick on what your thoughts are on the motion?
Only to say that I generally do agree, but that these two things can be bridged. But the problem, of course, is that when people like myself attempt to sort of bridge that, what you end up with is more or less a collapsing of the distinction into one or the other. And that's where I think the sort of the problem lies. So somebody like myself who's sympathetic to generalism, who wants to say that, well, you know, nonetheless, I have to admit there are cases where the generalist position isn't going to hold without further alterations or without some sort of revisions. The problem is we just end up sort of collapsing into a kind of particularism with some special features or whatever. And I assume something similar is possible from the other direction as well. So broadly, yes, I think it can be divided. The problem is that the divide can be bridged is what I'm trying to say. But my concern is that in doing so, what you end up doing is just defecting to the other side by stealth.
And then we'll just go to
Yeah, so I'm Keith Harris. I'm a postdoc at Ruhr University Bochum, Germany. I'm one of those endangered generalists, I think. So, but at the same time, I do think that the distinction between generalism and particularism is to some extent semantic. So basically, it comes down in part to a disagreement about what conspiracy theories are. Take a really broad definition, then particularism is sort of obviously true. Take a more narrow definition, then I think some versions of generalism are true. The other sense in which I think it can be bridged is that I think that there aren't just one, it's not just one particularist thesis versus one generalist thesis. There are many particularist theses, there are many generalist theses. So some particularist theses have to do with beliefs about conspiracy theories, some have to do with theories themselves. Some are epistemic, so it's about what's rational to believe. Some are more practical, it's about what should we do? Should we investigate conspiracy theories or not? And so my view would be that some versions of particularism are obviously true, but some are not true. And some of the more interesting ones are not true. So that's the sense in which we do.
Thank you.
Brian Keeley, professor of philosophy at Pitzer College, one of the Claremont colleges in Los Angeles. And I mean, I think also that following on what you were just saying, I think it is my own. This is giving a little bit of the punchline of my paper from later, but I do think that there may be just different phenomena going on under the term conspiracy theory, or even just different ways of thinking of it. So philosophers like to use the qua idea or the qua term. So conspiracy theories, qua scientific explanations, or just even just conspiracy theories qua explanation is the sort of thing that about which particularism is true, because for any given explanation, you just have to see whether it's a good explanation or not. But there's also this idea of conspiracy theories qua propaganda, right? The kind of political dimension of conspiracy theories. And if you look at conspiracy theories or look at the subclass of conspiracy theories that are political in nature, right, when they have a particular political agenda behind them, hence the propaganda, that is a place where I think generalism might be more appropriately applied. Right? But even then, there might still be a form of particularism depending on what is the propaganda in support of, right? But that it is propaganda, if you have a general attitude about propaganda, then that might be a general attitude towards the conspiracy theories. And the problem is that many conspiracy theories play both roles, or at least at some times, a conspiracy theory seems to be presented as a legitimate explanation, and at other points, it really doesn't matter whether it's an explanation or not. I'm, trying to forward a particular kind of political agenda by presenting this particular speech pattern of discussing conspiracy theories. And it just seems to me that part of this divide may also be philosophers, or at least I will claim myself to be a philosopher who came into this thinking about conspiracy theories, as explanations, and therefore approaching it in that particular way. But I think as the field has grown, people have become more interested. Part of the reason why people are more interested and why people are more interested in conspiracy theories is because of the political dimension. And it's not clear to me that we should treat political dimension and conspiracy theories and the use of conspiracy theories in the same way that we took them as, I'm just trying to explain why John F. Kennedy got killed, right? What's the explanation there? And that's just a different thing than I'm trying to get, a certain president elected.
I'm Martin Boudry from Ghent University, postdoc, philosopher of science. I'm actually relatively new to the field of conspiracy theory, although I dabbled a little bit in conspiracy theories more than 10 years ago in the context of irrational belief systems in general. So I guess I was a generalist avant la lettre. Although I do think that we have to move beyond the divide between generalism and particularism. I actually agree with Keith that some versions of particularism are so obvious that they're not even worth arguing about. I think if you look at the original definition, the Buting and Taylor definition, where they say that generalism means that conspiracy theorizing is irrational. I mean, that's so obviously false that no sensible person would ever, in his right mind, would ever put forward that thesis. And to the extent that social psychologists have sometimes created the impression that they think all conspiracy theorizing, every conspiracy hypothesis is by definition irrational, I think that's just based on misunderstanding, or at most they are guilty of some sort of sloppy terminology. You can achieve an easy victory for generalism as well if you say that if you define conspiracy theories as those theories that are by definition implausible and unfounded, of course then generalism will be true. In a slightly more subtle way, if you say that conspiracy theories are those that are rejected by epistemic authorities, then I guess also generalism would be true, but then the truth of generalism is just derivative then of the reliability of these epistemic authorities, and that will work in liberal democracies, but not so much if you live in the Soviet Union. So actually, I mentioned my background in pseudoscience, rational belief systems, and I think we can draw inspiration from like the old chestnut of the demarcation problem, which you're probably all familiar with. So on the one hand, you have people like Karl Popper, who believe, just cutting some short corners here, that there's one silver bullet to destroy all pseudosciences, that they all suffer from the same flaw, namely unfalsifiability. And then on the other hand, you have people like Larry Laudon, the particularists, or the extreme end of the particularist spectrum, who say, no, like there's no commonalities at all, there's no recurrent patterns, like every pseudoscience, actually we should get rid of the term pseudoscience, all theories should be evaluated on a strictly case-by-case basis. And I think if you think about it in those terms, I think a generalist is someone that is closer to Popper in the sense that I do think that almost all bad conspiracy theories, they're not just a miscellaneous bunch of theories that happen to have that have nothing in common except for the fact that they're irrational. No, I do think that they fall into the same traps. And I do think that there's some common ground with the particularists, like your paper and on suspicious conspiracy theories, Charles' paper on defectable conspiracy theories, and then Brian about mature conspiracy theories. I think that is moving. You can place that on the spectrum. I see this kind of approach also not as evaluating conspiracy theories on a strictly case-by-case basis, because you do look at some similarities, you do look at the histories, like some templates of false flag operations, etc. So I do think that it's a little bit moving in the generalist direction, except we go a little bit farther. We would say, I would say, for example, that almost all the popular conspiracy theories that we think about, and that's what social psychologists worry about, are defectable, suspicious, etc. So I'm slightly more generalist. So I would propose, instead of generalism versus particularism, that we talk about lumpers versus splitters. So I'm more on the lumper side. I think, like, yeah, it's basically, if I see some superficial symptoms that I've seen many times before, I'm going to say, yeah, this is probably irrational, especially if I have time constraints, etc. Whereas the particularists would probably say, yeah, hold on a minute. I mean, there are some differences. You can have mild suspicions, but you have to be careful. And I think that would be my attempt to bridge the divide. So I'm going to wrap up here because I'm talking to.
Super, thank you. Okay, so let's hear if that's the case.
Alright, so I'm still M. Dentith. I think I'm still the most famous New Zealand philosopher of conspiracy theories in this room. I'm probably also the reason why we have a problem with particularism and generalism divide, because even though the terminology is not mine, it belongs to Bunting and Taylor's paper, I think I was the person who kind of started pushing the distinction, which was then picked up by other philosophers. And maybe if I hadn't made that initial push, we wouldn't be having this debate right now. We'd just be probably analyzing conspiracy theories on a case-by-case basis, and also pointing out some of those theories have features that make them so suspicious that we end up going, they're just not worth talking about. So maybe if you just extract me from the conversation, a much more productive conversation might have been had, but I've also published so much that now it's kind of impossible. In principle, I do think the divide is bridgeable, and there are various reasons as to why that might be. So if you follow Nicky Pfeiffer's work from the article in Social Epistemology, he breaks down the conceptual space of where generalism and particularism fits, and under his logic of probability, all forms of generalism are just instances of limited cases of particularism. So basically, for a generalist, you're a generalist about subtypes of particular conspiracy theories. And I agree with Keith, there's a constellation of theses that we might call particularism. One thing which didn't come out in the keynote I gave yesterday, but is in the footnotes of the keynote, is that if you look at the original formulation of particularism by Bunting and Taylor, it's just we evaluate conspiracy theories on a case-by-case basis. In recent years, that's come to, we have to evaluate conspiracy theories on their evidential merits, which is a different formulation from Bunting and Taylor, which means that really when philosophers at the moment tend to be talking about particularism, they're talking about evidence particularism. And actually there are going to be other types of particularism. I think my paper, Suspicious Conspiracy Theory, is a form of feature particularism, identifying features of particular conspiracy theories that license certain kinds of suspicions that then have a requisite that someone should check. I don't actually say who has to check, but someone should check to make sure that they license this kind of strong suspicion. So yeah, I think in principle it's dividable, but I agree with Pat. Often what you get is not rather divide but conquer. So when you try to bridge the divide, you're actually not bridging the divide by finding a commonality or conversation between both sides. What you have is someone saying, no, I've conquered your position. You are one of us. And I think that might be the real problem, the discourse around particularism versus generalism rather than distinction.
Okay, so when you say the discourse, do you mean
philosophers arguing amongst each other in both the pages of academic journals and the reviews of journals?
Okay, so it seems like it's come out. So we have these distinctions in philosophy. Like when we study something, we tend to find divides. So we have pseudoscience and science, for example, and it seems like it's been helpful, I think, to have this divide, to be able to categorize what the intuitions are. And that's why it's been emphasized and picked up by every one of us in here, right? But now I get the general feeling that maybe this divide is not even necessary, even from you.
I mean, there's There's one sense where it might be necessary, and this was actually, I think, what Martin was hinting at. So it actually may not matter what the debate is in philosophy. You can identify what appear to be generous theses in other disciplines, notably some social psychologists, not all social psychologists, some social psychologists. And thus, I think it's an appropriate label in those situations. Look, the research project being presented here is generous in scope, and then we can critique that project on whether it actually adheres to generalism. So what if they end up using a perfectly neutral definition of conspiracy theory, but then only use examples which are unwarranted conspiracy theories, and then conclude from those examples that all conspiracy theories are basically unwarranted? That seems like a generalist project, and the particularist and the philosophical generalist can step in and go, well, there's some inconsistency there. There's some process here which has gone awry. And it seems like an appropriate distinction to bear on general discourse around conspiracy theories.
Fair enough. Let me just bring in Patrick quickly, and then we can have a bit more of a discussion. Because you wrote, and also for the special issue lately, just recently, you wrote about the different intuitions that come with the particulars and the generalist divide. So, do you want to tell us just a bit about that?
Yeah. Well, I maybe uncharitably sort of suggested that there's really two things going on in the generalist particularist discussion. And what's going on a fairly open and declared sort of level is a conflict between question about whether a certain kind or a certain recognizable kind of explanation is inherently dismissible or not, right? And I mean, in a sense, that argument's a long one, right? The particularists won that a long time ago. There's no question that there's nothing intrinsically irrational about conspiracy explanations, just insofar as they're conspiracy explanations. But of course, the attempt then continues to say, no, there are these other features that we need to build into our definition of conspiracy theory, which show that, in fact, as a class of explanation, these are problematic. So that's what's going on one level, and it's basically a straightforwardly empirical argument. It's straightforwardly epistemological argument, I should say. But I think what's also going on in the background is, in some respects, and Em has written about this before as well, that what's going on in the background really is a kind of undeclared argument about whether the world is particularly conspired or not. That is, whether the things we call conspiracy theory or things we call conspiracies are freakishly rare occurrences that we are entitled to simply not take into account when we're trying to explain observed events, or a relatively common part of the human repertoire of behavior and a fairly useful explanatory tool for understanding observed events, particularly on a political level. And yeah, I think that's where a lot of the kind of undeclared disagreement is actually going on, right? That people like me want to say, yeah, okay, Watergate happened, but stuff like that is rare, and things generally are exactly the way they appear to be, more or less, and there aren't really secret things going on in the background that are pulling the strings in ways that are radically different from the way the world appears to at least the clear-eyed analytic observer. And other people want to say that's incredibly naive. Of course, there's lots of conspiracy going on. People do conspiracy things all the time. And again, the problem with that disagreement, of course, and again, Em's written about this, is that there's no principled way in which you can kind of, settle that dispute, because it's fundamentally about more or less unfalsifiable assumptions about the way the world is. And those assumptions themselves will actually govern what sort of explanations we will, and indeed what sort of evidence we will and won't accept ahead of time. So, yeah, I that's kind of where I see the sort of the subterranean dimension of the particular generalist discussion going.
Thank you for that. Does anyone have a comment?
Can I quickly respond to Em? I think, as for the social psychologists, I have to say, I talked to some of them, not all of them, but I've never met a social psychologist who hadn't immediately backed off as soon as you point out to Watergate and where Julius Caesar. And then they really?
Stephen Lee would ask.
But how would they even respond to that? Like, they cannot possibly.
He defines conspiracy theories as follows.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But they're going to back off in that sense. That oh no, we're not talking about those particular hypotheses because those are well evident, etc. They're in the textbook.
They're just not conspiracy theories.
Yeah, but I understand that psychologists, they're just not interested in those theories, because you don't need to resort to special psychological explanations to explain why people believe in Watergate. It's just like, yeah, it's just common knowledge. Everyone knows that it happened. Only for the unfounded, the speculative, however you want to define them, they're interested in those cases. We as philosophers, of course, we are interested in definitions, but even the response that you've got, was it?
Well, so Stephen Lewandowski claims that all conspiracy theories are false and no conspiracy theories have been proven. Which means that,
Yeah.
so if it turns out that someone labeled Watergate as a conspiracy theory 3 years before it was proven, they must have been mistaken about the application of the.
Yeah, but then it's really a semantic issue. I mean, of course, he wouldn't deny that there are some real conspiracies in history. I mean, that would be completely insane. So in that sense, they immediately back off as soon as you point out that, like, oh, but there are real conspiracies.
But so the definition here seems to play a real part, right?
Yeah, and I mean, so Pat's right. A big question here hinges on how conspired we think society is.
Yeah.
And of course, that depends on your definition of conspiracy. Now, I, in print, argued extensively, I think the organization of the surprise party counts as a conspiracy. So by my definition of conspiracy, conspiracies are freakishly common events. And thus, if I get even just slightly suspicious that my friends are organizing a surprise party, an event which has never happened, I must add, even though I talk about it all the time, no one's ever organized a surprise party for me. If I start getting suspicious about those things, I'm engaging in conspiracy theory. Now, many people, including other particularists, do not agree with that definition. They think the definition of conspiracy needs to be restricted. I argue it needs to be unrestricted in that sense, because it tells us just how conspired the world could be, and that makes it reasonable to at least suspect conspiracies going on in the background. But that's, once again, a definitional issue.
Would it be easier, perhaps, sorry to chime in again, just a very good point, if we just started out with an obviously pejorative term like conspiracy fantasy or something like that? Because I think what is confusing about conspiracy theory is that the common, like it's an everyday speech, it's used in a derogatory way, even though on the surface it looks like an ordinary neutral term. But if you would start out with like an obviously pejorative term like pseudoscience, for example, which is like nobody wears that as a badge of honor, something like conspiracy fantasy, then even Lewandowski could agree, like, I'm only interested in the fantasies, I'm not interested in the real things. Would that resolve the semantic issue?
I mean, so if we're getting into the ordinary language debate, then we have to worry about, is ordinary language consistent cross-culturally? And and theorize issue, having lived in Romania, Romanians talk about conspiracy theories in a way which is very different from the way that Australians and New Zealanders talk about conspiracy theories, which is different from the way that Americans talk about conspiracy theories. And I'm assuming it's different from the way that people in the Netherlands talk about conspiracy theories. And there needs to be some cross-cultural work to actually establish, is ordinary language consistent in English across the globe? And also, how does it work in other language families?
Sure. So, Keith, you famously wrote your paper with some problems with the particularism.
I would say famously, but.
Okay. Well,
It is now.
it's very famous. Yeah. So, what do you think are the problems?
Yeah, so problems is even kind of a strong term. So like the basic idea was that we sort of talk as if there's one particularism and then it's very easy to disagree with each other, but actually there's many different theses, some plausible, some implausible. The kind of, so the substantive critiques were that, so I think that the definition that at least some particulars want to use is not the one that most people have in mind. So I think that if you go to the social psychologist and you say, well, that's, a conspiracy theory is just a theory about a conspiracy, so why don't you check that? Problem is that social psychologists will say, well, you're just changing the subject in that case, because what we care about are this specific type of conspiracy theories. I mean, so it's fine to have different definitions, but I think different definitions are suited to different purposes. And then, so the other, I would say more substantive critique was just, so in my view, a conspiracy theory is a theory that alleges a conspiracy, and that's inconsistent with what the relevant epistemic authorities say, a consensus of relevant epistemic authorities say. And so I think actually the point I make is sort of super boring point, that we're super reliant on epistemic authorities across all sorts of dimensions. And I think that in the case of conspiracy theories, it's no different. It's no different from knowing what's going on in some different country, whether it's in spiritual realm or not. We just have to rely on epistemic authorities.
All right. So back to the definition again. Brian, you point unwarranted conspiracy theories. So is that something that seems like is it something we should try to define? I mean, then maybe try to categorize it as something else. So let's say we're all particularists, right? But if we want to look at some particular conspiracy theories, then we should try to label whatever those are. So maybe unwarranted, or how was the reasoning?
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to yesterday's panel about interdisciplinarity, I mean, I think part of the issue here is it's not so much a debate about the definition of conspiracy theories as it is a difference in agenda of different intellectual inquiries, right? So as philosophers, we typically want to know the conditions under which, you know, a given explanation should be accepted, or doing something, taxonomic, right? Trying to figure out like what are the different varieties of a particular phenomenon, and should it be trait based? Should it be based on alethic principles or whatever? I mean, that's just what philosophers are interested in. So then when we turn to this phenomenon, that's what we do. Whereas I think, as Martin was pointing to, right, psychologists aren't interested in that, right? They want, their goal is to figure out why people believe shit, right? Anything, right? And then there's this interesting class of things that people are scratching their heads going like, yeah, I can understand why people believe in Watergate. That doesn't hit me as problematic. But why do people believe in QAnon? That seems problematic. And I want to understand, like, how does somebody come to the point of, expressing a belief in a particular thing? But that's not so much a definitional difference about conspiracy theories. It's just a different agenda about what it is about the world that you're trying to figure out. And I think that difference of agenda is also, problematic for being an interdisciplinary field, in that part of the debate is that people are just asking different kinds of questions, or motivated to ask different kinds of questions. And although, as we talked about yesterday, there are different methods, but the reason there are different methods is because those methods are being used at different goals, depending on, who it is, the group of people that are working together. And so, that's, and I think that was something Jan William was kind of making a strong point about as well. It's like, we have to agree on the methods first. And I'm just pointing out that, yeah, but why do you have methods? You have methods because you have certain kind of overarching goals of questions that you're trying to answer. And that's, methods are just your tools at getting at that answer.
Yeah, sure, good point. So back to it, on that note, and so you mentioned that you do research also, like some empirical research. And how would you say that differs depending on which definition you take on conspiracy theories? Like, does it affect the outcome of the study?
I mean, your theoretical framing basically decides the kind of inquiry you're going to engage in. And I think one way to bridge the particular generalism divide in an interdisciplinary sense, that's a hard word to say with speech disfluency. Okay. The easy way to bridge that divide is for people to be very clear about what their definition is, the extension of their definitions, and the operation of their definition. And I think that might be the benefits of having the debate about particularism versus generalism in philosophy. Is actually going, well, look, your operating definition doesn't actually match this particular part of your argument here. And all we're doing as philosophers, although apparently yesterday we might also be ourselves, is bringing that together and pointing that out. And I think that might also be why sometimes the debate in philosophy looks a little bit antagonistic. Because when philosophers do it to other disciplines, we're going to chide people into changing their behavior. But when philosophers do it, we go, okay, this again. So there's and that may sometimes cause the impression of there being this kind of antagonism. Philosophers find definitions to be really important.
Super interesting. Time is running away, so I think maybe it would be interesting to answer these questions. And then try to keep them brief, so as many as possible. Let's just start up here.
Yeah, thanks for the discussion. I just wanted to bring something up, going back to the idea of how important sort of the definition is. I'm sorry, this isn't a question. Just want to throw this in the room. It strikes me when you talk about definitions, of course, that strikes me as something that we can just pick and choose to some extent. Of course, as philosophers, we're not really interested in those types of definitions. We're interested in analyzing the concepts, right? And it seems when you talk about definitions, sure, you can just pick and choose. You can define conspiracy theories as theories about conspiracies. But if you talk about the concept, it's much less clear And I think what's doing real work there is that the move from conspiracy theory, that's just theory about conspiracy. So that's treating the term like water duck, right? It's just a duck, a real duck in the water. But I think many people would think that it's not like that. The term doesn't function like that, right? It functions more like rubber duck. No, that's not a real duck made from rubber. That's something else. So it doesn't function compositionally. And I think that move is doing lots of. I think all the social scientists, for example, would, they wouldn't say this, but I think you should interpret them as saying conspiracy theory functions like rubber duck. Just going to throw that out.
And I think I agree, and I would say hypothetically, if you could wave a magic wand and get rid of the conspiracy theory altogether, not just in the academic world, but in everyday speech, then I can't be too sure about that, of course, but I would hazard that some other term would fill in that vacuum to fulfill the same role. Because even the conspiracy theorists, like there was this French documentary that was released about the COVID pandemic, about all the hidden agenda of politicians, etc. And the very title of the conspiracy of the documentary was "Ceci n'est pas un complot." So this is not a conspiracy. And they were trying very hard to disavow the term conspiracy theory. But even they realized that you can get carried away because there's these other people. And they were pointing to the really crazy people, the QAnon people. They are the real conspiracy theorists. So I think another term, which I take your point to be that there's a concept that fulfills a particular role, and confusingly, that concept is now filled in by a term that has a superficially neutral definition. But that's just a happenstance. It's just the vagary of linguistic evolution, I guess. But that doesn't really change the underlying concept. That would probably stay the same. And M's point, I think, it's an empirical question, but in different languages, I would suspect that even in Soviet Union, for example, I think people would still have the intuition that conspiracy theories, even if you have a higher baseline of real conspiracies, that conspiracy theories are still tricky. You can get carried away, and you can get completely lost in fantastical notions. And that I think I would guess that's probably true across languages or across cultures.
Although in the Soviet Union, I also suspect the same is true of the term official theory as well. That if you believe in official theories, you might be getting carried away by Soviet propaganda.
True. Yeah.
And which is why the language issue is so important. I do make one other point on that. So in my work, I've always kind of argued that, look, I stipulate what the meaning of the conspiracy theory is for the kind of analysis I want to engage in. So I'm aware that ordinary language uses might be different from that of the philosopher. I just think that the minimal definition that particularists tend to favor is going to be more theoretically fruitful if we want to analyze what is wrong with belief in conspiracy theories. Sometimes you might go, look, the folk talk about things in weird and sometimes inconsistent ways. It's actually not very useful for a scientific investigation of a concept.
Briefly, so I think this is an interesting area of where we kind of agree, kind of disagree.
Yeah.
But I think part of our disagreement comes down to disagreeing about what are the relevant factors that contribute to why we should define it one way as opposed to another. So a lot of generalists, I think, want to rely heavily on ordinary language. You want to rely on theoretical fruitfulness. I also think we should have a definition that makes it uncontroversial. What's a conspiracy theory? Relatively uncontroversial. And so part of our disagreement probably comes down to what even would be the desiderata of a good definition of conspiracy.
Yeah, and it's interesting we're still having that debate more than 20 years after the debate started.
Well, also probably we don't know whether we're analyzing or we're engineering.
Yeah.
But also it's a bit of a moving target. What the term conspiracy theory covers in our culture is not the same now. I think even from when I first wrote about it 20 years ago, and Charles was writing about it, right? Conspiracy theories were more, the discussion was around things like kind of urban legends, right? This idea of these kind of fascinating stories that were kind of curious and they were the jokes, and they were kind of curiosities and so forth. And now it's all about politics, right? It's like we've got entire political parties that are either embracing or rejecting conspiracy theories. It's become part of the culture wars, and it's not clear to me that part of the problem we're having is that the target is shifting as we're going along. I mean, psychologists weren't interested in conspiracy theories in the 1990s or before, and that's, you know, why are they suddenly interested, or why are they interested now? Is because I think the phenomenon itself has changed in a lot of ways.
So wouldn't that be sorry, I'm hijacking, but wouldn't that be a reason to have the simple definition or the minimalist account of conspiracy theories, so that we can then narrow it down to whatever it is we were interested in looking at?
I mean,
Because
again,
it's a moving target.
I mean, again, it's like what's, you know, the definition is going to follow what your goals are. Like if you're a historian and you're trying to understand like what has happened, you know, if you're a historian who's writing about conspiracy theories in American history, then you're going to need a definition of conspiracy theories that applies across time. If you're just interested in what's going on in QAnon and politics in the West in the year 2023, you're looking at a much narrower phenomenon, so you might have a more.
But isn't that why we call it the particular? Okay, go ahead.
Why not just talk about QAnon then?
Exactly,
Why
like a
not-
particular
why-
conspiracy theory.
Why say it's like that's what I find sometimes problematic about social psychology research is that, yeah, we looked at believing these two conspiracy theories that are very close, or you know, like in the same country, very much, you know, important. Why not just talk about those then? Like, you know, like the Cinnabon control.
Yeah, but we have.
Right.
I think that's a sign, right? That it's like using conspiracy theory in a general way to say they're all as bad as QAnon or something.
Yeah.
It makes the conspiracy loaded in a way that
Yeah.
stops a very normal discussion. Probably
I agree, but I do think that there are similarities between QAnon, 9/11 beliefs, truther beliefs, that the moon landing was fake, and that we need a term for that. I'm happy to relinquish the term conspiracy theory. If you just give me another term.
Okay, sorry, just because we've got a lot of
Yeah.
questions. So just Julia as well.
Yeah,
No.
so I have, this is something that I've been meaning to ask for a long time, and like, you know, ever since I got into this literature. So if we decide, so if the minimal definition is put forward as stipulative, and as was saying, it doesn't seem that it matches ordinary language, at least the kind of cultural ordinary language that has been so far tested. On this note, I also want to say, knowledge is the kind of thing that, you know, in Roman languages, there isn't even a concept of knowledge. That doesn't stop the epistemologists who are talking about knowledge for 30 years. But if it is the kind of thing that's stipulative, why go against everybody and instead just say, you know, I have a research project. I want to know why people believe in conspiracies. So I'm going to talk about conspiracy explanations, or another, like, why not engineer with a different expression? And in this, I think that there's a ton of research being done in conceptual engineering and a whole debate about how we should engineer terms. And there's this whole changing the subject problem. And it seems to me that there is a risk of changing the subject when we talk about why do people believe conspiracies. So to bring it back to the particularist generalist divide on this basis, I would suggest, like, I really liked Martin's suggestion talking about lumpers and splitters, because that seems to be really what we, like, you know, I have a splitter project or a lumper project. That seems to match what people are trying to do better without like leaving the semantics kind of like on the side and making it less. So it's a question and a suggestion. Why don't we all talk about lumpers and splitters instead?
Patrick? Yeah. What do you think about that?
I'm not sure I do have an answer on that. I'm sorry. But I mean, I would say that, yeah, it's often quite chastening for philosophers to understand just how little other disciplines do actually care about the sort of definitional debates that we think sit downstream of what they're trying to do. And that, you know, most disciplines do manage to get quite a long way without actually getting into these sorts of discussions. You know, and philosophers will say, oh, there's a horrible conceptual confusion going on here. You clearly need us to write in and fix this up. But most disciplines manage to get by just fine without doing it. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't know if I've got anything more sort of coherent to say on that.
Yeah, look, I want to try and tell the panel why I don't like the term particularist. I was one of the three people with Bunting and Taylor originally pinpointed as a generalist. And when I read it, I thought, no, you just got me wrong. I'll give a specific example of a conspiracy theory I think it's rational to believe. So by your own definition, you clearly got me wrong. But so I thought, well, I must be a particularist. But I don't actually like the term, and I thought more about it because the way it's used, when people say of particularism, it's evaluating theories on their merits. Okay, so I've got 50 different theories to choose from. I work out what their merits are. That's great. I've still got to, if I wanted to decide which to believe on, I still would have made another inference, and it's been parodied inference. I've got to figure out which is the best one. And to do that, I can't merely evaluate theory on its merits. I've got to look at the merits of the relevant theories. So I just don't like the term because it's suggestive of this vacuous first step, looking at what the merits are, and it sort of glides over the second step. Yeah, so that's my 2 cents from the light.
Does anyone want to?
Well, I mean, having written a paper called When Inferring to a Conspiracy Theory might be the best explanation, talking about how we have to consider explanatory rivals when establishing the warrant of a conspiracy theory. I'd say it's kind of built in to an evaluation. You've got to do it. We have to do a comparison.
I mean, I think that's what Bunting and Taylor are getting at. It's just I think it's only a term for what they're getting at because they
so this sounds like it's also a semantic debate.
Yes.
Yeah. So you're objecting to particularism because it's the wrong name.
Yeah, I'm doing some marketing.
I see. Okay, all right.
Okay, before we get to Patrick, we're gonna have time for you as well. But just to Julia's point before, I think isn't it an important point to be making that that you made yesterday? That I mean, even in history, the ones that are accepted. That, you know, if you want to make the distinction between conspiracy theory and theory, they're two different things. These are the absurd, unwarranted, crazy ones, and then you have this other distinction between the ones that are warranted somehow. Even in history, we don't know. We can't even go back and check it. So how are we going to be able to classify some as, like, if that's the starting point, don't we just have to back it?
Yeah, I mean, there are curious metaphysical issues that come out of using ordinary language definitions, even if there is consistency. And I know that the work that you did with Kevin suggests that there's one way of engineering the term. I've got disagreements with that. Keith's got disagreements with the way that work kind of gets to its particular conclusion. But even if we accept that, we also have the metaphysical issue. What do we do with things like the explanation of the Moscow trials, which for 30 years, the official theory was they were free and fair, and the Dewey Commission were just a bunch of conspiracy theorists who believed that Stalin was up to no good. And it turned out Stalin was up to no good, and the Moscow trials weren't in fact free and fair, they were mock trials. And there are lots of examples of this stuff in history, of stuff which was called a conspiracy theory for a long period of time, and then turns out to be warranted. And you get this curious metaphysical issue of things going in and out of the class of conspiracy theory, which is why I just work with a stipulative definition. You know, I'm just interested in these theories about conspiracy.
Yeah, yeah.
Can I briefly say something? I think that's probably the most important point that I've taken from the particularists is that the Watergate scandal, for example, was initially dismissed as conspiracy theory. So that really strong to me the point that even a good term, and I do think that conspiracy theory in the pejorative sense is a good term, can be abused, of course. Even pseudoscience. I mean, creationists call evolution a pseudoscience because, of course, it's
some physicists call string theories.
And that's a boundary dispute.
Yeah,
I mean, the jury is still out there. And I would say even the term, Lee Basham's term, conspiracy theoryphobia, right? I think,
and also you guys term as well.
Yeah. So I think it's also so that can perhaps be an appropriate term for the premature dismissal of conspiracy theories, but that can also be abused. Obviously, David, I would say, well, obviously, you people are suffering from conspiracy theoryphobia because you don't even want to take seriously my hypothesis about shape-shifting lizards. And of course, we would say, no, that's really not a good application of the term phobia. So I'm saying yeah, it's a fact that sometimes the term has been abused, but that in itself is not a reason to reject the term. There's always boundary disputes around the use of any term, especially pejorative terms. They're always going to be used by people who are.
Sometimes it's easier just to stipulate and then work through that way. Yeah.
All right, we've got another question.
Yeah, I just want to circle back to something that David had said. Excuse me. I think I don't know what you all think. I think we need to be really careful about abandoning compositionality because it seems convenient, right? Sure, there are primitive adjectives like toy gun and rubber duck, but it seems like conspiracy theory is not one of these things, right? Excuse me, geez. It seems like, look, conspiracy theorists are going to say, well, I'm giving you an explanation. You might think it's a shitty one, but it's still an explanation. Whereas nobody's going to be like, no, this is a duck. It's a flesh and blood. No one's going to make that mistake. So yeah, it seems like we should be careful about going too crazy with abandoning compositionality for convenience purposes. I don't know, what do you all think?
We've got another question. Yeah. Do you want to? Does someone want to reply?
No, except that again, I'm very happy to relinquish the term perfectly, and I could just make exactly the same arguments about why I think all the public conspiracy beliefs are wrong without ever using the term conspiracy theory. If that's gonna make the particularist happy, then I'm willing to sacrifice the term to the particularist because
Thank you, Martin. Thank you.
Because I think it doesn't make a difference.
Oh, Charles. Okay, Charles, go ahead.
You're muted, Charles.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I want to suggest a way of producing peace and harmony, or at least rather more peace and harmony, which would, I think, be intellectually fruitful. You use the term conspiracy theory generally, just as a theory which involves a conspiracy. You might add that it has to have some pith a moment, but basically that's the minimal definition. That's how you define a conspiracy theory. But there's still an obvious problem. There are plenty of people who believe irrational conspiracy theories. So what we should do is, in order to sort of produce harmony between generalists and particularists, say there are conspiracy theories, some of which, quite a lot of which, are irrational. And then the focus of the discussion should be on two things. One, how do we characterize what it is for a conspiracy theory to be irrational? And two, then, how many of them are actually irrational? But I want to say there's something else. Do it this way, and it opens up an area of research. Because when you're interested in irrational conspiracy theories, then you say, well, why do people believe irrational conspiracy theories? Keep both parts of that definition in full view, because then it might turn out that why people believe irrational conspiracy theories is similar to the reason that they believe irrational theories of other kinds. So it's not the conspiracy part, as it were, that's important, it's the irrational part. And that would also stop the sort of vicious slide, which characterizes the ordinary language between people who start off with in effect, particularist definition of conspiracy theory, and then, since something is admitted to involve a conspiracy, slide to the view that it's therefore irrational. So harmony and peace, or at least more, let's distinguish between conspiracy theories and a very important subset of them, namely irrational conspiracy theories, and work out a set of criteria for distinguishing between those which are irrational and those which are not. And of course, it might not be, like black and white, it's probably a slide, but nonetheless, I think that would be the way to go. And that would have another advantage within the social psychology literature, namely that they won't be trying to explain two very different things. Why people believe in sensible conspiracy theories for sensible reasons, which is then explained as if it's the same thing as trying to explain why people believe in irrational conspiracy theories. So it would produce peace and...
nodding along here. So
Yeah, my worry is that focusing on irrationality, theories can be bad for many different reasons, and irrationality is one reason. But it's like, we spend this time in our intro philosophy classes telling students the difference between validity and soundness, right? And some conspiracy theories seem to be closer to being something that's more invalid, in the sense that like there's an inherent contradiction in this particular theory. This theory requires Princess Diana both to be still alive and to have been killed 4 years earlier. Like that's a bad theory, but it's a bad theory because it's irrational. It involves a contradiction. But then other theories are just, they're bad because they're unsound, right? So we have plenty of theories that are just, you know, they're not irrational theories, they're counterfactual theories. And there's still theories we ought not believe in, not because there's any inherent irrationality in them. They're perfectly rational, they're just false, or they're counterfactual in one way or another. And I mean, I think just the same as we spend a lot of time in philosophy kind of parsing out all the different ways in which theories might be wrong, right? Or, you know, sometimes we tell our students, it's like, your theory isn't wrong, it's not even wrong, right? You know, it's irrational. I think we need to be able to do the same sort of thing with conspiracy theories. You know, some conspiracy, I mean, my problem with David Icke's shape-shifting aliens is that it seems to be invoking magic, right? I mean, you know, or at least a technology that is so far advanced, you know, to be in magic as far as we can tell, right? Whereas, you know, plenty of conspiracy theories, I mean, it seems to me that a lot of conspiracy theories that we're interested in don't involve magic, but they're still just bad because they're ignoring, you know, the well-established, you know, actual determinations that we've made.
Very good point. We've got a question from Attila on the chat. Do you want to read it? Do generalists have any issue with conspiracy theories not targeting actors favored by them? For example, ones targeting Chinese or Russian governments. This way, don't they also apply?
I mean, as a token generalist, I will say that I'm not sure about the last one, but yeah, I mean, I think that conspiracy theories are bad in a sense, regardless of who they target. So a lot of the sort of more outlandish Trump-Russia conspiracy theories were bad, regardless of the fact that they might have been favorable to my sort of political leanings, and they're bad in part. So, I mean, one thing is that, like, I think that allegations of conspiracy are valuable, right? And so even if you think that, even if you think conspiracy theory is generally bad, you want to protect like allegations of conspiracy as being like valuable alarm calls. And so when there's a bunch of bogus allegations of conspiracy, that sort of undermines the value of people being able to make serious allegations of conspiracy, right? And so even if we are critical of conspiracy theories, that might be in the service of actually helping people who want to expose legitimate.
Can I briefly add something?
Did Patrick, did you want to jump in there? Or it looks like you were getting ready.
Just really quickly there. I mean, I would say there is certainly a value to that, which is the value that's kind of built into the sort of standing suspicion that you need in any kind of healthy polity, right? A sort of standing suspicion or interrogation of power. There's no question of that. But every accusation also comes as a moral cost. And that also needs to be weighed up against that, right? That anytime you posit a conspiracy, you are also positing conspirators. And it might be vague, it might be a generalized they are doing this or someone somewhere is doing this, but it's usually more specific than that. And that has a cost to it, right? I mean, saying that it's even thinkable that this particular person would do this thing, that's not a morally neutral act. That does come at some kind of cost that we need to sort of take into account. I think that would take us too far off track here, but it's just an important complication to that point about the value of accusation.
Thank you. Okay, does someone just say something to summarize? Or
very quickly, I don't like the Chinese government, but I do think that the idea that they designed COVID as a bioweapon is conspiracy theory. And I also think, and this is Patrick's point, is actually it's a shame that we can't really discuss it at length. The idea of how conspired the world is in general, I would say, even in a country like China, which obviously has a higher baseline of conspiracies, and I would be more paranoid probably if I were living there, even in a society like that, I think there are many more irrational conspiracy theories than there are conspiracies, because conspiracies are so easy and facetious and frictionless to generate that even in a very conspiratorial society, you're still going to have a problem with the proliferation of irrational conspiracy theories.
So on that note, I think there really is like a difference of intuition here, at least to how conspiracy theories, how often they occur and what they are really. So we haven't managed to divide I would Bridget, the divide, not in this talk anyway, or this panel discussion. But thank you so much for your participation. And I know there was a lot of questions, so maybe you can catch the panelists later when we have a coffee break. And we say thank you so much to you, Patrick, and see you
Thank you.
later.
And get well soon.
Yeah, get well.
Yeah.
Hope you get better.
Thank you. Appreciate it.